I've started with a very light drawing. I used a 4H pencil and a very light hand to get the outlines. I don't want those outlines to show up heavily in the drawing itself. I'm blocking in each chunk of hair. It's easier for me to work smaller chunk at a time versus all the hair all at once. If I try to do all the hair all at once, I lose track of which clump was which, and it ends up just becoming a huge mess. So I do recommend break it down into smaller sections so that it doesn't get so overwhelming. I'm layering several colors on here. There, I'm using the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner with a taklon filbert brush. With these brushes, you can really use very inexpensive ones. This is one time that you don't need the highest quality. It's not going to make a difference. You just want the taklon bristles. Although I do recommend trying out several different types of brushes to see what works best for you. So you can see here, there's that gritty look still on the colored pencil. That's normal with my first several layers. I will get rid of that the more I layer on top of it. When you're drawing hair, you want to make sure that you're drawing everything in clumps. Don't try to draw each individual strand. While there is a place and a time for having these individual strands show up, you don't want it everywhere. You know, if you do too many, like the actual individual strands, you end up looking the hair ends up looking very wiry, which is not what hair looks like. Well, hopefully for most people, if it's clean. I'm using both Polychromos and Luminance for this. I'm using lots of shades of different browns and the reds and oranges. Although I will come back through with some of the cream colored Luminance pencils, forgot what I was saying there for a minute, to add the individual strands, as you can see I'm doing now. These are just opaque enough that they show up, but I don't want bright cream colored strands. So the fact that the pencil isn't going to be bright here is perfect. I just wanted a few strands to show up. Now, watching this sped up, it appears that I'm working in straight, sketchy lines, and that's really not what I'm doing. I'm generally working in small little ovals or small circles. That helps me to get better coverage overall. If you do a bunch of sketchy lines, it ends up showing in your finished work. Now I'm using the paint thinner again, softening that out. Now, no section here as I'm working on the hair, none of the hair is really going to be finished until that whole side of her head has hair on it, and then I'll go back through and do any touch-ups that are needed. But I like to get everything approximately blocked in. I'm blocking in the darker sections first, so that when I come back through with the reds and the oranges, I'll still be able to see where the darker clumps go. With this, I don't worry so much. Everyone is always asking, which colors are you using? It doesn't really matter. I mean, if it's red hair, I'm going to use reds, oranges, and browns, several of them. But if you're a little bit off and you don't use that perfect color, it's not going to mess up your work. It's more about your values and your highlights and your contrast and all of those things. I've talked about this so many times, but everyone keeps getting hung up on, I need to know the right color. I need to know the perfect colors that you used. Don't worry so much about that. Worry about your contrast. Get your values in there correctly. Only once have I seen a student come in with something where I'm like, oh, you used the wrong color there. She was supposed to have purple and she ended up with green. I mean, way wrong color for what she was working on. I'm not sure what happened there. But other than that, every single time a student has brought me a piece that they were having trouble with, it was their values and their contrast that were preventing it from looking realistic, not their color choice. Although, that said, I did happen to write down the colors that I used on her skin just this once, because this is a reference photo from Paint My Photo. A lot of people are going to be drawing the same one, and so it makes more sense then to share those colors with you guys, or to take that time to do that. But when I'm working on another portrait that is not one that's royalty free that you guys are going to be drawing, it wouldn't make any sense to share that information, just because the reference photo that you're working off of, the portraits that you're working off of, are all going to be different. The light source, the person's actual skin color, really the light source makes a bigger difference than anything. Or not, yeah, light source, I am saying that right. It is too early. But all of those things are what really matters. But I am going to break my own little rule and share with you guys the colors that I used on her skin. It will be listed in the video description and on the Patreon feed. Notice that it almost looks abstract at this point, just big clumps, big lines, but you want to make sure that you're following your reference photo so that it ends up looking like hair. You don't want to just put random lines all over the place. That's a mistake that I see a lot of people make. That, or trying to make everything too straight or everything too wavy. Anything too uniformed is really going to be a problem when you draw hair. Pay close attention to your reference photo. And after you've done enough portraits, you're not going to have to pay that close of attention to the reference photo. But when you're first starting off, you want to, because you want to learn the feel of the hair, how the hair moves. I'm using that cream color to add in a few individual strands on top, which also gives me some highlights. I probably had 10 or 15 different pencils out for the hair. Just all various shades of reds, browns, and oranges. If you try doing something and finding the one perfect color for everything, it will be very, very flat. It's really important that you're using several tones. So even here where you're thinking, oh, she has red hair, I just need to find the one perfect color of red, it won't look right. It'll look flat. It takes lots and lots of colors built up in order to get that three-dimensional realistic look. And that's not just for hair, that's really for everything. The main problem I see when people's work looks flat is that they try to find that one perfect color and paint everything that one color. Now notice on the strands of hair, some of these are going opposite directions or streaking over other clumps of hair. That gives it a more natural feel. One thing that might make it easier for some of you when you are drawing hair is to do it upside down. Look at that as abstract shapes and stop trying to think of it as hair. But if you can copy those abstract shapes, it's going to help you to get it more realistic, or more accurate to the drawing, I should say. Drawing portraits upside down is a really good idea anyway, especially when you're getting started. But even me, when I've been working on a piece for a while, I will put it upside down. It'll help you to notice details and little features that you might have off, because it tricks your eyes. You're not anymore looking at it as hair or as an eye. When you flip it over, it just totally messes up your head on how you're viewing it, and you're actually comparing the shape of your reference photo to the shape of your drawing. Notice as I work, again, I don't have those streaky lines all over the place. Everything's pretty soft from the reds into the browns. That's because I'm doing those little circles, which it doesn't look like that's what I'm doing, but I promise it is. But I'm able to overlap that way and just do a whole bunch of little circles or little ovals, and it just gives you a much more even coverage. One of the problems that I see happen a lot is where people are working straight lines, maybe vertical lines, and then they'll be doing horizontal lines, and then they're doing diagonal lines all over. Those lines end up showing. So make sure that you get that really smooth look by doing the little ovals or the little circles. Or, I mean, you don't have to use those circles or ovals, but do whatever method that you choose, make sure that you're not seeing those lines and pencil marks all over the place. If you're seeing those, then you need to try a different method. Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner again. If you are not in the US and you can't find the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, you can try Zest It. I've not used it, but I've heard from a lot of people who said that they liked it. I guess it has a really nice orange smell too. Most of the time, when people are using paint thinner and they're having a hard time getting everything to be as smooth as what I'm doing, it's because they don't have enough pencil on the paper in the first place. Notice that I'm doing 3 or 4 or 5 layers before I ever blend with the paint thinner. And then I do 3 to 5 more layers and blend with the paint thinner again. And I just keep layering and layering and layering until I get rid of that grainy look from the paper. Now this time I'm working on the Stonehenge paper, the white. This is really, really nice for portraits. I was really happy with how the skin tones blended out on this. Now, honestly, if you're working on like the Fabriano like I normally work on, and you try Stonehenge for the first time, if you've not done a lot of work on the Fabriano, you might not notice a huge difference. But I did notice that I was able to get it to blend a little bit smoother. Really, my finished product was very similar to what I would have gotten on the Fabriano. It was just easier on this. I would feel really guilty about sitting here and rambling for 2 hours on this video, but I figure you guys can just mute it if you're not interested. Yay for the mute button. Now all of the hair is done the same way, just lots and lots of layers with the reds and the browns. I'm even using a bit of black on the really dark areas, although I'm going pretty sparingly with the black at this point. I'll come back later and add a lot of black for some of the darker shaded areas. The paper that I've got under my hand to keep the oils from my hand off the paper and keep me from smudging it is that glassine that I talked about recently. Actually, I talked about that in the email newsletter. So if you're not getting that newsletter, you missed out on that. But that's what I'm using here, and it's really nice. I normally had used tracing paper, but tracing paper can pick up some of the lead from the pencils and smudge it a little bit, which I really didn't have a problem with on any paper except the Stonehenge. I noticed that the Stonehenge gets dirty a lot easier. So the glassine is a really nice alternative. I spent an entire night just working on this side of her head, and I work very fast, so it may take you 3 or 4 nights to get that much work done. Don't feel like you have to work really fast. I know that these videos can be really deceiving and appear that I got a ton of work done really, really quickly, and usually I didn't. While I do work faster than most, it's still not nearly as fast as it appears on video. And the nice thing with colored pencil is that you don't need to rush. You're not fighting a dry time, so you can take all the time in the world. Take whatever time you need to get it just right. And I would say there's 4 or 5 hours worth of work on that side of her head. Again, blocking in clumps of hair and looking at it as abstract shapes. Do not put random lines all over the place for hair or it will look really fake. So I've got one layer of colored pencil covering all of that hair. Here's the second layer on top of everything else with a darker burgundy red and some lighter orange. I forget what color that is. It's not really orange, it's kind of a tan orange brown color. And then the paint thinner. So really I only did 2 layers over all of that bottom hair before I started blending. I broke my own 3 to 5 layer rule. Now here where I'm doing the hair, I'm using a lot of paint thinner on the brush, but normally when I work on the skin, there's barely anything on that brush, because if it is, I end up with brush strokes all over the skin where I don't want them. With the hair, it doesn't really matter because I'm working the brush strokes into the strands of hair. But that is something that you want to keep in mind, and it takes a lot of practice when you're working with paint thinner, learning the right amount, how much paint thinner you want on the brush for different areas that you're working on. So now that I've got that blocked in, I'm coming through and doing some of those more individual strands and darkening up clumps, better defining the hair. That cream colored pencil again for the individual strands. And those Luminance pencils stand out so nice against darker colors. The Polychromos cream or white really won't show up against these if I had used that pencil. So this is a case, if you are using Polychromos, at least get a few of these lighter colors. In Luminance. I guess I should have finished that thought. Get a few of these lighter Luminance colors to go with your Polychromos. It is too early for me to be doing this. One of the things that I do recommend you do if you're new to drawing hair, or even if you're not, having a scratch piece of paper where you can try out and practice different colors and layering combinations, because the order that you layer things will make a really big difference. If I put down the brown first and then red on top of it, it's going to be very different than if I put red first and brown on top of it. So you want to test all of that out before you hit your actual project. Notice I'm not really going over any area that I did the lighter strands with that cream color with paint thinner. Once those cream strands are on there, I pretty much leave that area alone. That's my final layer whenever I'm working on hair. Some people will use an X-Acto knife to get detail out in the colored pencils, but because I'm using the paint thinner, the X-Acto knife really doesn't do anything for me because the paint thinner is pushing the pigment of the pencils way deep into the paper. So just scraping off a light layer of the pencil doesn't do me any good. And here, just like when you're using or drawing fur, you want to pay attention to the direction of the hair. So important. I can't stress this enough. Don't just start putting random lines all over the place. Pay very close attention to your reference photo. I'm pretty sure I spend at least as long looking at my reference photo as I do working on any given portrait. You really want to study the details there. Now when I use the paint thinner, I normally let the paper dry for a few, like maybe 30 seconds before I go on top of it with colored pencil. You can go right ahead or go immediately onto it with the colored pencil if the paper is a little bit wet from the paint thinner, but you get different results than if the paper is dry. Another thing for you to test out to see what works best for what look you're trying to achieve. Refining details, I'm using my black Polychromos now, and I'm keeping that pencil really sharp. Again, paying attention to abstract shapes. Are you sick of hearing me repeat the same thing over and over again? These things are just so important, though. You can see my pile of pencils down below my easel there. There's a lot of them and you're only seeing a few. I put a roll of that shelving paper underneath my easel, that rubbery feeling stuff, and that keeps my pencils from rolling all over the place and it keeps my easel from sliding all over the place. Strongly recommend that stuff. You can get that at Walmart or anywhere really. It's just that big roll of shelving liner, but the rubbery kind, not the patterned decorative stuff. Now I am working on the skin. For the most part, when doing portraits, I really prefer the Luminance for skin to the Polychromos. I use the Polychromos for certain areas, but I just get smoother results if I stick to mostly Luminance pencils. I'm putting down a layer of burnt sienna 10% first, which is kind of a rose color. Way more rosy than I'm going to want her skin to be, but I've tested this out on another piece of paper, so I know which colors that I'm going to layer to get the look that I want. Starting just with her forehead first. It's easier for me to start with smaller or work in smaller sections than to try to do all the skin all at once. Now I am using titanium buff, which is that cream color. I'm going right over everything. It looks like I'm scribbling, but I'm not. I'm still doing those little ovals and circles. Now I am using a peach color that I apparently didn't write down. I'm not sure which color that is. I'll go check. Okay, that peach color was actually burnt ochre 10%. Now I am using Nougat, something like that, with Polychromos. That's kind of a yellowy brown color. Now I am back to the burnt sienna 10%, darkening areas up. I want to make sure that I've got a lot of pencil on the paper. If I don't have enough pencil on the paper, when I go through and blend with the paint thinner, it's going to be real blotchy and grainy. The first layers will be grainy to an extent anyway, but it's a lot worse if I don't have enough pencil on the paper. And now I'm blending that out with the paint thinner. My brush is not nearly as wet with the paint thinner as it was when I did the hair. And that's going to be even less so as I do additional layers. Because if you've got too much paint thinner on there and you have a lot of layers of the colored pencil, it'll get to where the paint thinner is just moving the paint around, or the pencil around, but you're not really blending or smoothing anything out. Now I'm going back on top of it again with the burnt sienna 10%. I used a lot of that pencil on this portrait. I should probably order another one. It is a color that if you are doing somebody who's very fair skinned, it's probably one that you're going to use no matter what the lighting is. At some point or another, this is a really good pencil to have. That one and the burnt ochre 10% and the titanium buff would all be really handy to have. Although, in reality, I think they're all handy to have. I'm kind of obsessed with having as many colors as I can possibly get my hands on. Here I am using Caput Mortuum something. It'll be written in the video description, but that one is by Polychromos. It's another one that's a little bit of a rosy brown color, but darker than that rose color, the burnt sienna that I was using earlier. Now I am using violet gray, and I use that a lot on this piece. Really on any really on anything I draw. I use violet gray all the time. It's kind of a purpley gray. I used a bit of Paynes gray in there too. Not sure if I've used that one yet. Softening that out with the paint thinner. Now when I use the paint thinner, I definitely prefer a filbert brush in most cases, with the brush that has the rounded tip. It helps me to avoid as many brush strokes. If I'm using a flat brush, I find that I get way harsher lines and end up with more of the paintbrush strokes in the finished work. So for most things, I will use that filbert. If I'm doing fine little details, then I'll switch to a tiny flat brush. Notice I work the brush in all directions to try to get rid of any brush strokes. Now I am using white to pull out highlights right on top of the skin. That white Luminance pencil is amazing. I've not found anything that even comes close to touching what this pencil can do. Okay, I take that back. The Prismacolor white can come close, but it's still not as good. You can see I'm just going over everything again in little circles and ovals. Notice how I hold my pencils too. I don't typically get my hand right up close towards the tip of the lead. If you do that, you really end up losing control. I know when you're first starting, it feels like you have more control if you're holding your pencil right up near the tip of the lead, but you don't. You want to get in the habit of holding your pencil back. And if you are in the habit of holding your pencil up front, it will take you a while to break that habit. So it's something that you just have to keep reminding yourself of. But the same with painting. You don't want to hold your brush up close. You just lose a lot of control in doing that. Blocking in her eyebrows. Now her forehead isn't anywhere near done, but I've got enough in that I can kind of start blocking in some of the other areas. And one of the reasons that I don't do all of the skin in one go is that I like to get some of these darker areas in, like with the eyebrows and the eyes, because it makes it much easier for me to judge my values and how dark my skin needs to go. If I don't have any of those dark areas in, I'm going to go way, way too light on the skin. Now, while it is better to go too light than too dark, I'm still going to want to be semi-close on those values. And I've layered this the exact same way that I did for the forehead. First with the burnt sienna 10%, followed by titanium buff, burnt ochre 10%, nougat, however you want to say that. One of you guys can let me know how that's pronounced properly in the comments. Blending that out with paint thinner. Now, if you're not using paint thinner, you can get similar results by burnishing, but you want to hold off on your burnishing towards the end. If you've not, or if you're not really familiar with what burnishing is, I will put a link in the video description to a video showing you how to do different blending techniques. But with burnishing, you have to add a lot of pressure with the pencil, and it can be really hard on your hand. With me, I have arthritis in my right hand, so that doesn't work out so great. Plus, I actually do like the results I get better with the paint thinner. The paint thinner saves a lot of time too. And if you are burnishing, you want to keep the actual burnishing or the pressure with the pencil towards the end. As I work, every single one of these layers is very, very light until I do my last layers where I do a little bit of burnishing. And even with paint thinner, I will use a bit of burnishing towards the end of each layer. But that's like 20 layers in. If you push too hard with your pencils early on, it may seem like you're getting better coverage, and so that's better, but what happens is you're flattening out the paper so that the paper can't take additional layers. So it's much better to use a very, very light hand as you work and save any hard pressure or pushing hard on your pencils for the very end. But again, that video explaining the difference between, or showing you how to burnish and what that is, that will make all of that make a lot more sense. You can see that I keep using my hand to wipe off pieces of the colored pencil on the piece. That is a horrible habit to be in. Get yourself one of those drafting brush things to wipe your pencil shavings away with. I was just too lazy to get up and get mine. Now, the skin under her eyes is pretty flat. It's fairly solid. I'm going to have to do a lot of shading and contouring there later. Speaking of contouring, if you are a woman or a man who wears makeup, I'm not going to judge you, but if you're someone who does wear makeup or do contouring with makeup for your cheekbones and the side of your face, all of that actually makes doing portraits a lot easier, because the contouring that you do with makeup is the same thing that you're going to do on a portrait as far as where you want your shadows in your darkest areas. So if you look up beauty channels on contouring, watch those. That may be beneficial for everybody for understanding where the dark areas go on a portrait. You don't need to do it as extreme as some of these girls do with their contouring, but it gives you an idea of where your lightest areas and your darker areas on the skin tone should be. Now, working on the eyes, look at how dark I've got the white of the eyes. It's not actually white. I used violet gray first, and I'm putting more violet gray there. Now, another thing on her, at this angle, you should be able to see her up the tear line for her upper eyelid. But her makeup, she's tight lined. And what that is where you're taking an eyeliner and lining your tear line. So you're not going to see that in this portrait. But normally when you're drawing people, especially if they're not wearing a bunch of makeup, you're going to see some skin color right underneath the eyelashes before the white of the eye starts. But here it's just going to be black because she has so much heavy makeup on, which is one of the things that drew me to this piece. I love drawing makeup. I don't know why, I just think it's fun. So I've used a grayish kind of sage color for the eyes, and then I'm using brown around the edges. I've got that yellowy gold color inside. Now, one thing that I want to point out too, a lot of these pencils, like the Polychromos comes with silver, bronze, and gold. I don't ever use those pencils, ever. If I want something to look gold, I'm going to achieve that by the colors and the values that I'm using in my pencils. So here where I'm using a goldish tone, I'm not actually using gold. It's just a gold toned pencil, not the metallic one. That's the word I'm looking for. These are not metallic colors. I avoid those all the time. I think those would be fun if you're doing cards or crafty type arts, but not so much for the fine arts. Again, look at how dark the white of that eye is. And it's really obvious here up against the white paper. Now, the shine mark on the eye, I've left that mostly white. You don't want to fill that in with dark pencil and then expect it to get really, really light again later with the white. Remember, all of these colors are fairly translucent, so if you want something to be really white, you need to leave it white in the first place. Don't expect your pencil to get it for you. Now there's the black outline with where her makeup is. darkening up that eye, the white of the eye even more. Here is that pink area on the inside corner of the eye. Don't skip over that. You don't want the white of the eye going from corner to corner of her eye. It won't look right. You've got that bit of skin on the corner. Look at your eyes really closely in the mirror at where that little pink, I don't know what it's called. I should probably look that up. But look where that is and make sure that you're reproducing that in your art, because if you miss it, it will look really, really weird on your finished portrait. And the eyeshadow for her was a bit of a challenge for me. Because of the lighting difference, it appears that her shadow is completely different on one side than it is the other, and it's just a difference of the lighting. While her eyeshadow may be a little bit off, I doubt it was that as extreme as it looks in the photo. So I actually did balance that off just because it was something that was bothering me. I wanted it to be the same, but I'm pretty sure it was the light source that was making it look like this eye had less eyeshadow than the other. So I did pull it up a little bit higher in the end so that it would match the other eye. Or match it better anyway. So several layers there. I'm using different tones of browns, grays, and reds. Some orange. Now, for the most part, deciding which I want to use, the Polychromos or the Luminance, it comes down to just the color that I want. But in the case of skin, I will almost always go with my Luminance over my Polychromos for creating the base colors of skin, just because it goes on so much smoother. Using paint thinner. Now here's where I'm using that small flat brush for the little detail. And then I'm switching over to a filbert for the larger area so that I don't have a whole bunch of pencil or paintbrush marks. Using a dark gray and a sage green to get some more detail in her iris. I'm keeping my pencils pretty sharp for this. One of the things that I do to keep my pencil sharpener, I did make a video about this that will be up at the end of this month or beginning of next month. I'm actually really ahead on videos right now. But when I sharpen my pencils, one of the things that I do, because when I want to keep a really fine point, is I just keep a piece of sandpaper next to my easel. And I just sharpen the tip, just the tip of that lead on the sandpaper. That way I don't have to eat through tons and tons of pencils using the sharpener when I just need that point a bit sharper. You may be able to see that at some point in the video. I don't remember if the camera was angled to where you could see that later on or not. Now here I've got the inside skin, the upper lid. You can see it a little bit. I will end up darkening that up a lot just because she is wearing a lot of mascara there. And the eyelashes, pay attention to which direction they're going and how they overlap. It's pretty normal for the eyelashes to form almost a triangle where several of them at the base connect to one point at the end. And normally on women, I would not, or men or women, anyone, I wouldn't put the eyelashes this dark, but she is wearing the heavier makeup, and so I'm going against my normal rule there where normally I'll start eyelashes with a lighter brown and then darken up just bits of it with black. But here, she's wearing a lot of mascara, and so I want to make sure that those are nice and dark. But if you're drawing men or children, do not do the eyelashes like that, or they will look like little drag queens. There, I'm darkening up that upper tear line. But it's still separate. You can still see the difference between the tear line, the iris, and the eyelashes. It's still too light here. I'll end up darkening that up more later, but you can still see that it's there. Missing that tear line is something that I see a lot of artists miss, and it really makes their work look flat. You're not going to see the tear line on her lower lids at all because of the angle of this shot. I'm using an ink eraser there. That one is by Faber-Castell. The ones that you get in the US have a cream colored casing on it. The one that I'm using is from Mexico. One of my viewers sent me. The ones from Mexico I like better because they don't have the brush on the end. The ones you get in the US have this stupid black little brush to wipe away pencil shavings with, and they also cost like 5 times as much. Notice all of the shades that I've got in that eyebrow. It's not just one solid brown. And now when I do eyebrows, I normally won't go that dark either. But again, because she does have heavier makeup, her eyebrows are penciled in more. So she's got it to be a little bit more solid. But even as solid as hers are, you've got areas that are much, much darker and areas that are a lighter brown. And pay attention to the color of the eyebrows, because your model, if she's dyeing her hair, her eyebrows may be a very different color than her actual hair color. Whereas if someone has natural red hair, her eyebrows are going to naturally be red. So again, pay attention to your model. I'm using that titanium buff is that kind of cream color there. Actually, I lied. That color there is brown ochre 50%, that yellow color for her eyeshadow. Titanium buff is what I'm going over the skin with. And back to that burnt sienna, 10% for that rose color. Now, some of those areas with that, I'm pushing a little bit harder, and then areas where I'm not going to want it as dark, I am going lighter just to block everything in. But I'm still not pushing so hard that I'm damaging the paper. Well, I normally save, oh look, I missed a whole chunk there. Well, her eye was done the same way as the other one. Well, I normally save the eyelashes for the very, very end. On that eye, I did loosely block them in so I didn't lose the direction that they were going in, because I did have such dark makeup on that side. Sorry about missing that eye. Although, it's pretty much the same exact as what I did on the other side. So now back to the burnt sienna, 10%. I'm going to block in that whole cheek. And notice how even the coverage is on the skin there. No heavy lines or marks. Just little circles and little ovals will get me that look. And a very light hand. I am not pushing hard. Now I am using, that one was brown ochre 10%, which is not on my list, so I guess I should write that down. Blending that out with the paint thinner. Now here, if I get the paint thinner accidentally over her hair, I can just use my finger and wipe that area off. But I will end up coming back through with some of the reds and browns again to sharpen up the edge between the her cheek and her hair. I do want to say though, that's not outlining it. You don't want an outline on anything. Cartoons have outlines. People do not. We have shadows. But her hair is dark enough along the edge of that cheek that that will be a sharp or clean line there. So I'm going over that with the burnt ochre 10% again. And that is the Caput Mortuum something or another Polychromos pencil I'm using here. And back to burnt sienna 10% for her upper lip, or the skin above her upper lip. While the shading on this side of her face, because it is getting more light, is very subtle, you want to make sure that it's there. If that all ends up one solid color, it is going to look really flat and really bad. This is sped up a little more than 4 times. Don't paint fast. Don't think you have to go as fast as what it appears here. You're not fighting a dry time with colored pencils, so work slow. It's one of the things that's nice about this medium. It's very relaxing. If you're working in acrylics, you're constantly fighting that dry time. And then with the oils, you've got so much time where you need to stop and wait for it to dry a day before you can go back to work. Well, a day, assuming you're using the fast drying medium like I do. Weeks if you're not. But here, there is no dry time issue, so you can take your time. Again, on those eyelashes, make sure that they're not straight lines. They all curve one way or another, but they're not straight lines. And normally on lower lids, if someone's not wearing heavy makeup, you're not going to see such defined lines on the bottom lashes. Those are almost always going to be very, very light. I'm using white to pull out highlights, just like I did on the forehead. And the white's really nice because when you blend that out with paint thinner, it works almost like a glaze, where it's still translucent enough you can see through it, but it softens everything up. White is also a favorite of a lot of artists just for burnishing. The nice thing with colored pencils, if I were working in oil or acrylic, when I blend the up, like this section here above her lip, when I blend that into the cheek, you would have such definite lines of where you stopped and started if you were letting it dry in between layers. With colored pencil, you can blend one section into another beautifully, even if you have those harsh lines when you stopped in one area. With painting, you don't. They all have to be blended softly all at once. Back to that burnt sienna 10%. And Caput, I'm so saying that wrong. Caput Mortuum, I don't know what that is. Now the nose is tricky because you don't want definite lines. The only definite lines I have is on the darkest portion of the nostrils, and even that will fade out. It's not just going to be a huge dark line. And then the bottom nostril, or one of the edges of the nostril. But even then, it's not a harsh, there isn't a harsh line at all. It's just darker than anywhere else. But you don't want to put lines on the nose or it will look very, very fake. Once that's in there, I'm going on top with the white to pull out my highlights, and this is going to soften everything up quite a bit. Now you can see I've got kind of a definite line on that outer edge of her nose on the left-hand side of the paper. That will end up being softened up quite a bit with white later on. I just needed it to be dark enough that it would show up when I did put the white over it. A lot of what I'm doing is just experience, knowing that I need that to be darker because I'm going to go on top with white. After you've done lots of portraits or lots of colored pencil pieces in general, you'll just get to where you know what you need to do to get the effect that you want. And it does come with time and practice. So don't be frustrated if you're like, how am I ever going to know what line I need to put where, that I need something to be darker? You just need lots of practice. You have to remember, most things with art, it's trial and error. You have to try it and mess it up in order to get to the point where you learn which methods are going to work best for you. Better defining the shadow on the side of her nose. Now, one color that you're not going to see me use a lot that I do have in my finished piece is purple. I went on top of a lot of this with purple and gray on the shadow portion of her nose and then the right side of her face. Well, I guess her left side, our right side. But when I thought that I was finished, everything felt a bit more red than I wanted when I looked at the finished photograph, or what I thought was a finished photograph, and I did come back on top of everything with some purple and gray to tone all of the reds down. As you're working, when you think you're done with an area, it's a really good idea to take a photograph and load it into whatever photo editor you want next to your reference photo. All kinds of stuff will stand out to you that you didn't notice when you were looking at the actual piece. Now that the paper under my hand is moved out of the way, you can really see how very dark the whites of her eyes are up against the white paper. You have to do a lot of shading with them too. You don't want them just all one solid gray violet, which is my base in most cases for the irises or whites of the eye. But you don't want just one solid shade there. You've got to have your darker and your lighter areas in order for that to look three-dimensional. As I work with colored pencils, because I do have so many colors pulled out of my set, I was probably using, I don't know, 50 colors here, I'm not sure, but a lot of them, I don't put them away with my other pencils until I'm completely done with a piece. I keep them in a separate little cup so that I can easily remember which tone it was that I was using. If I have to keep pulling out each individual color that I need, I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of extras that I probably didn't need. That didn't make any sense. And layering here is just like everywhere else. First with the burnt sienna 10%, the titanium buff, which I didn't mention earlier, which is this color? I've got it in front of me. Brown ochre 10% is being used a lot here, especially on this side because it is darker. Violet gray and white. And then for the Polychromos, the Nougat, and Caput Mortal whatever. Now, I don't normally use white until I've already blended with the paint thinner, and then I'll put the white on top of that to kind of burnish it all together. The titanium buff is the lightest color that I normally put over all of the skin, at least for the first few layers. So adding in my shadow here. When I add in the shadow, knowing that I'm going to come back over with white or one of my lighter cream colors, I'm going to go much darker than I need my finished result to be. So I'm kind of breaking my own little rule of go lighter than you think you need to be. But here I know I've got to go dark because the white will go over it and lighten it up a lot. And just a reminder, I am not just looking at that reference photo once. I am constantly looking at it, constantly comparing what I'm doing to that area of the reference photo. Now, I like to have my reference photo on a computer screen instead of printing it out. Years ago, when I first started painting, I would always print everything out, but that doesn't always, depending on your printer, it may not print your values quite right. So looking at the computer screen, I can blow up any given area and really see the details in what I'm doing. So I'm adding the pinks on the underside of her cheek there. Coming on top of that with a deeper red color. And blending it out with paint thinner. This brush, as it's getting used, because I use that same one so often, the bristles are starting to get frayed, and it's even better now than it was when it was all new. I'm finding that I'm getting a softer look with it as the bristles get more and more damaged. I'm going to keep reworking some of these areas to get rid of as many brush strokes as possible. Darkening up the shadows even more. I can't stress enough what a light hand I'm using for this. It's easier to get a soft look too when you're using that light hand. If you're pushing very hard, you're going to be more likely to have heavy lines that are hard to get rid of. Notice that the inner nostril, it's not just one big black raisin in there. It fades. You've got that outer edge that's darker, and it fades into a lighter reddish brown or browns out into the skin tones. And I talked about this on last week's tutorial with the lips, how you've got that shadow underneath the lower lip. Without that shadow, if you just put the lips right up against the skin, it'll end up looking like the lips are flat, or flat against the skin. It just ends up looking really weird. So make sure that you're getting your shadows and your highlights where they need to go. See, I told you that tutorial was good for any medium. And again with the highlight, or the paint thinner. Now I've got more paint thinner on my brush here than I probably should have, and you can see, because you can so see all of these brush strokes, I should have dabbed more of that off, because having that much on there, I'm getting a real blotchy look all over the place that I don't want. This is a case where you really want to make sure that you've got the right amount of paint thinner on your brush for whichever area that you're working on. I've got a lot of blotchiness that I'm going to have to go back through and cover because I was being careless here. Now as the paint thinner is wearing off, you can see that I'm not getting so much of the blotchiness. Oh, except I was stupid and re-dipped my paintbrush into more paint thinner. What was I thinking? But see all of the blotchiness there? I just had my brush was way too wet. It would have been much better, and I would have gotten a smoother look on this layer had I had much less paint thinner on there and worked a lot slower. Well, that's just a mess. Well, at least I know why it happened, and I can tell you guys how to make sure that doesn't happen. So now I've got to go through and get rid of all of that blotchiness. So by me being careless there and having too much paint thinner, I created a lot of extra work for myself. It's not that it can't be fixed, it's just a bit of a pain. When I do hair, I'll use that much paint thinner, but oh, that was too much here. So darkening areas up, again trying to get rid of the blotchiness that I did for my laziness. I'm using almost a purplish red here for some of these shadows. And then a red that's more of a brick red color. Now I'm using white to pull out the highlights. Now this is going to help me hide a lot of the blotchiness that I had happen earlier on. I'm still going to have some of it, and later on, which is not in the video, I do a couple more layers over it. Putting white in those highlighted areas, and then when I blend that out, it should smooth out a lot of that mottled look I've got there. Now with the white on a lot of this, I am adding more pressure than I did earlier on, where I'm letting the burnishing do a lot of the blending. And a brush that again has too much paint thinner on it. Now the brush that I'm using right here, it's a watercolor brush. It's a much softer brush and I don't use it that often. I will usually use it though for some of my final layers of the skin. It does tend to give you it's easier to get a really soft look, but I'm really getting the top layers of the colored pencil are what's getting blended here because you're not pushing very hard with that brush. It is so soft. But this is a case where you want to play with the different brushes and see what works best for you for different techniques that you're trying to do. Now I'm back to the taklon bristled brush. And more white. Layering the white over all of those dark areas will soften everything up a lot, which is usually important when you're doing skin. Now on the darker areas of the skin, while I'm still adding white over it, I'm using a much lighter hand than I did on the really highlighted areas of her cheek. Again, pulling the darks out under her lip. As I work, you'll see I get most of an area done and then I move on. Like I had most of her nose done, then I moved on to her cheek. Once I get everything else in on her face, then I'll continuously go back to the nose and adjust things as needed. It's easier for me to see where I need things light and dark as I get more of the portrait worked in. So I get as close as I think I need to be, or as close as I can, and then move on and then come back to it later on once more areas of the portrait are in. And I don't just do that on people, I do that on animals too. I jump around all the time. I've got less paint thinner on my brush now, so I'm getting a much softer look as I blend this out. Although some areas are still pretty blotchy, and I'll have to keep reworking that till I fix it. It's interesting for me now to watch this. I don't remember having used so much paint thinner on those earlier layers where I ended up with that very, very blotchy look on the skin, and I can really see the mistake that I made there. I would have cringed had I seen a student doing that in person, and yet here I am doing it myself. So again, more layers on that cheek, smoothing it out. Now I keep a piece of Viva paper towel because that's what I use when I'm oil painting. Very different than using regular paper towels. They absorb the paint thinner or oils much, much better than a regular paper towel would. You can also use an old t-shirt or a rag, but when I dip my paintbrush into the paint thinner, I will then go through or dab the paintbrush onto that cloth or onto that Viva paper towel to soak up or dry up as much of that paint thinner as I can get. I just, in most cases, just want it to be barely damp. So I'm using that eraser, that ink eraser, to pull out areas that I'm going to want highlighted, and then I go over it with white. By lifting off some of the areas with the eraser first, it means more colored pencil will stick on top of it. So where I wanted part of that nose to be lighter, I kept going over it with the white colored pencil, but it really wasn't lightening it up enough. So I needed to lift some of that colored pencil off the paper so that the pencil had more to stick to. Now that her skin's in, I can define her eyeshadow better. Now I'm not just using black for those edges, I'm using a lot of various grays as well, and browns. Pulling out those lower lashes and defining the upper ones. And these are the same. You can't really see it so well here, but for those eyelashes on the top, they're usually going to be 2 or 3 lashes that are clumped together to form one tip out towards the end of the lashes. So you've got this thicker pyramid-like base, and then they get thin towards the inside. But make sure when you do that pyramid-type base, don't fill it in solid black. You should be able to see the individual strands at the base that meet to one tip. Coming back through and defining some of her eyebrows better. Even here, I don't have them quite shaped right. I'll have to come back later and touch that up. Making sure that some areas are darker than others and paying close attention to my reference photo. And you can see I'm back up to the nose again, better defining the nostril. And I will still end up reworking different areas that I notice later on again and again and again. Okay, now onto her teeth. Just like the whites of her eyes, these are not white. I'm using different very light shades of gray and burnishing that area with the white there. And again, burnishing, just adding extra pressure to my pencil to let it blend out. Defining in between her teeth. Now be careful when you define in between teeth that you're not just putting straight lines all over the place. Otherwise your teeth end up looking like chiclets. I don't know if that's a good example. Do they have chiclets all over the world? It's a type of little square gum. So here's that violet gray along the top. Again, these teeth are really dark, and she doesn't have dark stained teeth. She has nice white teeth, but your teeth, when they're reflective. That surface is reflective depending on what's around them. You don't want the teeth to be solid white. So I'm using that small flat taklon bristled brush to blend that out. And now I'm coming back through with a white to highlight these. And with this white, I am adding more pressure than I did on many other areas. And burnishing with that. You can see I added the line between her 2 front teeth, and then I went on top of that with white to tone it down. You don't want harsh lines. And the teeth aren't perfectly smooth, flat shapes. You're going to have a lot of shadows and ridges in there. At least when you're working this large. If you're working on something that's very, very small, you don't have to try to draw in each individual tooth. It usually will just be the hint of the tooth there. This is large enough that each tooth will be added and shaded. So I'm starting with the upper lip. The upper lip, now this is going to be a little bit different. I did the lip tutorial recently and showed you guys how the upper lip is going to be darker than the bottom lip. Now she's got very full upper lips, so she's going to catch a little bit more light on them anyway. But on top of that, just the fact that she's wearing so much lipstick here, her lips are already so dark that kind of tones down the difference between the upper and the lower lip. And so they both end up being very similar, although the upper lip is still a bit darker, but not as obvious as the lip tutorial I just did was. And even though she is wearing heavy lipstick, that outer edge is still slightly feathered. So I'm maintaining those creases in that lip, blending that out with paint thinner. Now I'm using brown to darken up the edges. The reason that I've got a bunch of color on the edge of the pencil there is because I was using the sandpaper to sharpen the tip of that pencil. You can see there's not a whole lot of lead left at the tip there, but enough that I didn't want to sharpen the whole pencil just to sharpen up that edge. So I used a piece of the sandpaper and rolled the pencil along it to get that fine tip. So this piece is actually fairly a limited color palette, but even so, I've got like 50 pencils or so, probably more, I don't know, pulled out. Even when you have a limited color palette, it's usually going to take a lot of colors in there to get a very natural look. Although, if you don't have a large set, you can get a realistic look as long as your values are correct. I'm pulling some of the red from the lips down into the teeth, because that would reflect there. You want to make sure though that it doesn't just look like she has lipstick all over her teeth either. You want it to look like a reflection. Using white to define some of the lines in there now. The edge of my pencil is very sharp. It looks like I'm using a really dull edge, but I'm not. Now that her lips are in, it's a lot easier for me to judge the values on my teeth, and so that's why I'm going back and reworking them now. After I get the bottom lip, I'll do some more touch-ups as well. These are not just random lines. Pay close attention to your reference photo so that they're going in the right direction. You also want to pay close attention to where your shadows fall on the lips. Well, yeah, usually the main shadow is going to be towards the inner lips and on the upper lip being darker than the lower. Your light source is going to make a huge difference. So being that my light source is coming from the left side, the inside of the left side of that lip there close to her teeth is going to be darker than it will be on the other side, the right side of her lip there, if that makes any sense at all. The point is, pay attention to your reference photo. Don't assume that what you saw once you've memorized, because I promise you, you have not. So that area that I just put in is going to be the darkest area on her mouth, or the darkest area on the bottom lip, I should say. And that outer edge, again, is very sketchy. Again, I'm using that flat taklon brush there, the small one. When using the small areas, it just gives me a little bit more control, or blending out the small areas. Adding in some creases now. Now, your creases don't have to be exactly the same as in the photo, but they do need to go the same direction. So watch for that. I have to keep these pencils really sharp for this. So I'm really taking advantage of that sandpaper here to keep those pencils sharp. Now that those lips are in, it is much more obvious to me that the inside of the nostrils need to be darkened up a bit. I'm using those same dark colors in some of the lips, or some of the dark shadows of the lips. On to the neck. This is the same way that I did on her cheek, where I'm starting with the burnt sienna 10%. I'm going over that with titanium buff and brown ochre 10%. Blending that out with the paint thinner. This being my first layer and it all being one pretty solid color where I don't have a lot of shading, I can use more paint thinner here without ending up with a lot of a huge blotchy area like I did earlier on. If you use more paint thinner, it goes faster, but you're also moving around more paint, and that's what, or more of the pencil lead. So that's a part of why you get that blotchy look. And the shading here is done just like it was on the side of her face. I'm adding the darker areas. Because of the camera angle, it looks like her jaw is skewed or drawn wrong here. It's not. It's just the angle of the camera. I'm using a very, very light hand for layering these shadowed areas in. Adding the burnt sienna 10% on top of the light area of the neck there, and then blending out again with paint thinner. And I'm probably using more paint thinner than I really should be at this stage. I'm basically making it harder on myself to get rid of the blotchiness. You have to keep in mind when you're using paint thinner, your goal is to soften it and spread it around. But one of the things that you can do on accident is lift some of that color off of the paper. And that's more likely to happen if you have a lot of paint thinner on your brush. And that is how you're going to cause the blotchy look. I'm using a dark gray here. It's a warm gray for a lot of these shadows. I remember when I worked on this area, I was thinking that my shadowed areas might be too dark, and it turned out they weren't even close to being dark enough. I had to come back through with some of the darker grays and black to darken up the edges a lot. But better to be too light than to be too dark and have to try to lighten it up later. Blending that out with paint thinner. It looks like I've got a more appropriate amount of paint thinner on the brush this time. See how much smoother it's going? That's because I have much, much less paint thinner on the brush. Oh, too much. I must have dipped it in the paint thinner again. Now I'm back to having too much on the brush. Good job, Lisa. Now I'm starting towards my favorite part, that shirt. I had so much fun drawing this. And now I really, really want to draw some roses. Just all those ridges and waves and all the shadows in there were so much fun. I'm using a lot of the violet gray here, and I'm going to use a blue tone for some of the cooler areas, and gray and some black, and white, lots of white. Now, I worked on one small ruffle at a time and then worked my way out from there. One thing that a lot of people will do is try to put your base coat on the entire shirt and then the highlights on the entire shirt and the shadows on the entire shirt. It gets really overwhelming. You want to break it down into smaller areas, and that way you can pay close attention to each teeny tiny detail. There's my glassine back on there so I'm not rubbing my hand all over the paper. So that is really dark after I blend it. Now I come back through with the white white Luminance pencil. Add some highlights on that. And I'm burnishing with that white, so I'm doing a lot of my blending with the white itself for lightening up portions of the shirt. So now I will move on to a single one of the little petals on the front of the shirt. While the shirt is this silvery white color, you have so many shadows in there that very, very little stays really white. Blending that out with paint thinner. I have no idea what I'm doing right here. I see my hands moving, but nothing is happening. There we go. So I've burnished white on top of that for the highlighted area, and then going around the edges with the darker areas for the shadows, better defining those. And all of the shadows at this point on that shirt aren't even close to being dark enough. I'll come back later and define them more. It's so easy to think, oh, it's just a shirt. It doesn't need that much work. The eyes are the main focal points. That's where I'm going to spend all my time. Every single bit, every single inch of your piece is just as important as every other single inch. Nothing should go fast or be so fast, much faster than anything else. Take your time. If you rush over any single area, it's going to show. And this goes for backgrounds as well. If you're having trouble with your backgrounds, if your subject matter looks really, really good, but your backgrounds never do, it's probably because you're not spending enough time on those backgrounds. I usually spend more time, there's a lot more hours put into my backgrounds because it's generally a larger area, but more time will normally go into those than my subject matter. Don't think that because something isn't the main focal point that you don't need to pay just as much of attention to it. Now, that doesn't mean that every area needs as much detail as every other area. That's totally different. But you do need to spend as much time on each area, making sure that it looks as good as every other area. And if you're working on something that's got a landscape or something like that, and the background, the things that are farthest in the back probably aren't going to have a lot of detail, but you still need to spend a ton of time making sure that you've got it just right. There was a tiger drawing that I did back in January. It was a 16 by 20 inch colored pencil, which was huge, and I am not working that big again in the near future. Actually, I probably will. But anyway, it took so long, and that background took, I'd say about 2 days, 2 or 3 days longer than the tiger did. I put so much time into that background, and that's not even the main focal point. It just, especially with colored pencil, it takes so long to cover each square inch. So it doesn't really matter what you're putting in that square inch, it's still going to take a long time. Don't rush stuff. This is where sometimes working smaller may be a better way if you're having time issues or you're wanting things to get done quicker. Work smaller, not faster. had about 4 or 5 colors that I used on that shirt, which is less than I normally use, but I used it throughout the entire shirt. Just that violet gray, blue, I forget which tone of blue that was, gray, like a dark gray, white, and I ended up coming back through with black to darken up some of the creases. That blue is almost a periwinkle blue. It's got a little bit of a purple tint to it. It's closer to purple on the color wheel than it is to gray. Or to green, I mean. When I draw flowers, or in this case clothes with the ridges and stuff, I'm not too worried about every single line being exact, but I do want it to be pretty close. I mean, if one of my petals is slightly too large, no one's really going to notice. Well, you guys might because you're seeing the reference photo. But if no one saw the reference photo, they wouldn't necessarily notice, or if I skipped a ruffle. Not a huge deal. But I do like to go for close on here. I'm just not going to waste a ton of time making sure it's exact. Like when I work on the lips or the eyes, I want that to be as exact as possible. But when I move on to the clothing, I really don't need to spend as much time there. I just need it to be close. That doesn't mean to rush through it, that it's not important. I sound like I'm contradicting myself. I'm just saying if it's not drawn the exact same, I'm not going to stress about it. But I do want it very close. One thing that won't show in the video, because I went back and did it a day after I thought I was finished, I did come back through on the highlighted areas of the white and erased it with the ink eraser, and then went back over it with white so that it was really, I had a much higher contrast there in the shirt. I felt that my whites weren't quite as light as I wanted them. But I didn't notice that until I took what I thought was the final photo and loaded it onto the computer. There's the sandpaper I was talking about that I keep on my easel. I just roll the pencil along it, or through the, that didn't sound right at all. I roll the pencil on its edge down the sandpaper to sharpen up the point. And here I definitely needed sharp pencils because I've got a lot of teeny tiny details. And if I sharpen my pencil every single time that I need a sharp point, I'm going to eat through a lot of the pencils, and especially those Luminance being as expensive as they are, I do not want to waste them. This shirt is a really good exercise in contrast and understanding where you want your lights and your darks. You've really got to pay attention to that in order to create that three-dimensional look. People will ask me all the time, how do you draw curtains or how do you draw waves in fabric? Like everything else, you follow your reference photo. Get a decent reference photo where you can see where your lights and your darks go, and you copy that. And once you've done it a few times, you won't need to be so dependent on that reference photo to understand how the waves and ridges in fabric work. But it's so much easier if you start off by copying a photograph of some, or if you've got curtains in your home that you can copy working live. Now, if I were painting this with either acrylics or oils, I would probably do this a little bit different. Instead of working ruffle by ruffle from the beginning, because of the way that the dry time works, I would probably layer a solid base color of that violet gray first, then draw my details, and then go through and paint in the details with the highlights and blues and everything on top of that little ruffle by ruffle. But here with colored pencil, it just seems to be easier to me to start with one little individual area at a time. And it's the same with skin. If I'm painting skin, I'm likely going to paint all of the skin, each base layer for the skin, the neck, the ear, everything all at once, so that everything blends in together. It doesn't, when painting, if you end up with harsh lines, it's a lot harder to work out than it is with colored pencil. With the colored pencil, you don't really have to worry about that, so you can work one little area at a time. But if you are painting, don't take these tips and think that that's necessarily going to be the best method. Sometimes it would be better to layer full sections at a time. If you're working with a real light hand throughout, you're never going to have a time where you completely mess something up that you can't fix it. If you're using a light hand, the paper can take so many layers, so if you have a bad layer, just work over it. But if you're pushing really hard and burnishing right from the beginning where you're flattening out and damaging that paper, that does limit you by a lot. What determines which area I'm going to work on a colored pencil piece next, whether it be here where I've moved from the ruffles down to the blouse instead of finishing the ruffles, usually has to do with where my hand is going to rest. I don't want to continue the ruffles and then have my hand rest over it, even though I can put the glassine over it. It's just easier for me to work from the left side and move my way over. It's one of the reasons I will normally start with the upper left-hand side of the paper when I'm working in colored pencil. While there are exceptions to that, that's normally where I'm going to start. Now here, if you look at my reference photo, which again you can find on Paint My Photo, that one, the blouse has more of a brown tone in with the satin white color, but satin isn't a color, satin fabric, whatever. But I chose to use more of the purples and blues and pull that out because I'm using so much of those colors in her skin. It was just personal preference there. But because my values are correct, it still looks very realistic. So again, back to the colors aren't as big of a deal as people tend to make them. Adjusting the colors here did not make my shirt look any less realistic than the reference photo. I also adjusted the skin tones on the reference photo. I took that photo into Photoshop and made some adjustments. I hyped up the contrast quite a bit on her skin. I made it a bit brighter. Just, again, personal preference there. So my skin colors itself are not the exact same as the reference photo, but it still has a very realistic look because my values are correct. So again, values are so, so important, whereas the color, not such a big deal. I'm not saying to paint the face green, but you get my point. Hopefully you get my point. Now, wherever I'm using the black for some of these shadows, I have to be real careful that it's not just a black line. It needs to fade out. I've got the harsher line on one side, but it always fades out into the lighter area. You don't want it to look like you've got a lot of outlines all over the place. I'm just darkening up some of those definite intersections of the folds and the creases. Gives it a little bit more dimension having that contrast in there. You can see this area of the shirt, like I was saying, every area is just as important as every other area. So where you may think the eyes or the cheek or the, the skin tone should take the most time, not necessarily. I'm spending a ton of time on this blouse. The skin tone went much faster. The smooth skin planes went way faster than this shirt is. And if you get to a point where you're like, this is tedious, I don't want to work on this anymore, don't just rush over it. Take a break. Stop working for the day if you need to. Go get yourself something to drink, whatever. Step away from it. When you start getting to where you feel like you're rushing it because you just don't want to work on a certain area, it doesn't interest you for whatever reason, stop working on it for a while. Chances are, if you push through that, you'll start rushing things and things start not looking so good. So even if it's just a 5-minute break, take a break. For me, I will generally push through those areas just because I'm listening to audiobooks, and so it helps me to stay still longer. So the little tedious things don't seem so tedious to me. Before, when I used to listen to music while I worked, I did find that I would get more impatient a lot faster. Having a good book to listen to definitely helps for me. Which is funny because for years I thought I would have listening to somebody read me a book, that just sounds weird. I'd rather read myself, but I don't have time for that. So I listened to a book for the first time, but it had a really good narrator, and it was, what a difference listening to a book with a good narrator versus a bad narrator makes. But I got hooked and found that I'm now able to sit still a lot longer when I work on things. I still will occasionally listen to music while I work, but if I do, I won't sit still for quite as long. So if it's something with a lot of tedious things, I always switch to an audiobook. If you're not sure if a narrator is going to be one you can tolerate or not, Audible, you can test out books on there or listen to samples of what that narrator sounds like. Another thing that I think helps when you have areas that are very tedious is to have a very realistic expectation of how long something should take. If you watch this video and think it's 2 hours long so I can get this done in a single night, that's not realistic at all, and so that can be a little bit discouraging. I want to say I worked on this for about 5 days. But again, I work fast and I don't have as many interruptions as a lot of people do. So that's something to remember too. So don't beat yourself up if you spend a lot longer. It is not a race. But having the idea that it's probably going to take you a week or so to finish something may make it easier than if you expected to have something done in a night. I will usually set goals for myself. Like here, I wanted to get the hair on the left side completely done in the first night. Now I went back through and did a few touch-ups later, but I knew that's as far as I expected for myself to get, knowing how fast I work. And again, that's going to be easier to have an idea of how long it'll take you once you've been working on portraits or in colored pencil or whatever medium for a long time. But I knew I wanted the hair done in one night. I wanted the forehead and one eye done in the second night. And then I wanted the other eye and the nose done, and I believe part of one cheek done in the next night. And then I wanted the mouth and the rest of the face and the neck done. I want to say the neck and the shirt took me a single night. The point is, just have a realistic expectation and how much you're going to get done in a night. It makes it a little bit easier for me to sit still that way too. And setting those goals, instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to try to finish this all tonight, that can start getting overwhelming when you realize 5 hours later all you've done is the hair. Okay, now onto the other side of the hair. I think I've sped up the video just a little bit here because it's the exact same thing that I did on the other side. I am just breaking it up into clumps. I'm going to block in my base layers. I will blend those out, throw in some more layers on top of that, and my final layer for each individual section of hair will be using that titanium buff to get in a few individual strands. Remember, do not overdo individual strands. Think of it in terms of large abstract clumps. Really look at your reference photo. So my first few layers, I'm really just paying attention to where my darkest areas and my lightest areas are going to go. I'm not too worried about it being the exact color or all the little details at all yet. This side of her hair has a lot of darker colors in it, just because it's within the shadow on her face. When drawing in the hair, I'm not as worried about having harsh lines like I am with the skin, where I talked about before using those small ovals and small circles to make sure it's very, very smooth. Here, I'm not as careful with that. If I have a harsh line, it doesn't really matter. It's going to get covered anyway because there are so many lines that get put in with the hair. So sometimes I get lazy, and you can see some of the harsher lines in here that I wasn't careful about, but they won't show up in the end at all. Notice that the hair is much darker right behind the ear there. It's going to fall into a shadow more. Now I'm starting on the ear. Here I am blocking in first using the Caput, Mortuum, whatever, Polychromos pencil. I'm blocking in my darkest colors here first with this so that I don't lose those edges. And then I'm going to use the same colors that I used on the rest of the skin. Now, there won't be a ton of highlights here because this is falling within a shadow. I'm using a dark brown color to add in the darkest shadowed areas. Just like everything else, pay close attention to your reference photo. All of a sudden I can't talk. But the ear is just as important as everything else. If you skip over this, it's going to look terrible in your finished piece. Or rush over it, I should say, not skip over. Obviously, if you completely skip it, it's going to look bad. Everyone's ears are going to be shaped slightly different, so your reference photo is very, very important. Now my ear is kind of blocked in half, or sort of in half, by a strand of hair, or a big strand of hair that's going over the ear there, so I'm kind of skipping that upper section. I'll come back and define it a little bit better later after the hair is in. The ear, just like everything else, it's not harsh lines, it's shadows. Some of the shadows are a little bit more defined, but they're still shadows, not outlines. Now at this point, now that everything's pretty much blocked in, this is where I start going back through and better defining or correcting shadows and highlights and getting everything just right in the piece. I actually still need to go back through with that titanium buff to get highlights in the hair, or the individual strands of hair on the right side. But it's so much more obvious now where I need to correct some of these shadows now that everything else is in. On these final layers, when I use paint thinner, it's really important that there's very, very little paint thinner on that brush. Otherwise, I'm going to get a very mottled look. It'll end up pulling up too much pencil. When drawing animals, it's not something that I worry so much about because you're not trying to get such a smooth look. But on people, it's a pretty big deal. So putting the glassine back under my hand where I'm working on the inside of the neck, darkening all that up. Now I've got to make sure that the hair fades into the skin nicely. I don't want such a harsh line there. So I'm pulling the shadows back through and blending that into the hair. You will be able to see where the hair starts and the shadows begin on the skin, but you don't want it quite as harsh as what I've got right now. Now at this point, I pretty much thought that I was finished. I mean, I'm doing these little last touch-ups, but I really thought these layers were my finished layers until I took that photograph and realized, oh my gosh, I need like 2 more hours worth of work. Those last 2 hours are not going to be in the video. I should have recorded it. I didn't think it was going to be that much more that I'd keep finding details to work on. But basically the main difference that I did that you're not going to see in the video was in adding a lot of purples and grays into the skin and softening it out, because I still had that very blotchy look from having earlier on used too much paint thinner on that brush when I was blending the skin. But the techniques that I used are the exact same that you're seeing here, just less paint thinner. There were just a few other various things that some of my highlights weren't as light as I wanted. Over her left eye, the right side of the portrait, that area was a lot lighter than it should have been. That one needed to be more in shadow. So those were things that I adjusted that are not on this video. You can see here how much smoother everything is, and I did come back through on that shirt and hype up the contrast on the light areas. That is it. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below.